Hello everyone and welcome back to the channel. In this video I'm hoping to revisit Pacific Battles Malaya, which I've left alone for rather a long time. Those of you who've seen the previous videos will recall that we were making efforts, so myself and a friend of mine, Doug, were trying to improve this game because while it's a lovely, lovely game, as you can see, with beautiful components, it suffered as published from really, really awful substandard rules. So much so that the only way to make it playable after a lot of experimentation was to make fairly hefty alterations to the combat rules, and as we discovered through playing it a lot, also by altering the supply system, making it a bit simpler, and just generally putting in a few other minor tweaks. Now, what I'm going to do today is play through a single turn to demonstrate our new rules, which really have been bolted onto the existing structure of the rules to show you how a game turn will work in the way that we play it. And as I said in the previous video when I first discussed our proposed changes, if you've got this game and you're struggling to make it work, I really hope that what you see here today will help you, because as Doug and I discovered, there is a great game hiding underneath the skin here. It just needs some help to come out, really. So I'm going to talk you through a single turn. I'm afraid the length of the game precludes doing a blow by blow from start to finish. And I hope you'll also forgive me not starting on turn one. The reason I've done that is twofold. One, as is very often the case when you're simulating something as high risk as the Malaya campaign, if the Japanese do not do well with their initial landings, it can skew the rest of the game. And the second reason is I wanted to use turn one as an opportunity to run through our changes one more time, just to make sure that nothing weird was happening and that the beneficial effects of the rules changes we've made weren't a fluke. Let's put it that way. I wanted to make sure that they didn't do anything too weird, and I'm happy to say they haven't. So I'm just going to give you a broad overview of the situation at the start of turn two. So there's going to be a tiny bit of zooming in. Let's just bring the camera down so I can visit different portions of the map. So over here in northern Malaya, the Japanese have made successful landings as they did historically at Singora, Patani, and Kotabaru. Now, I touched on this in the previous video. We have completely thrown the game's setup out of the window because the setup as given in this game did not permit any kind of historical deployment, even if the players wanted it. So the British deployment, with some alterations, has broadly followed what was done historically. To mix things up a bit with the Japanese, I kept the original landing sites, but what I've done is assign the 5th, 18th and Imperial Guard divisions to slightly different areas to those they received historically. So the Imperial Guard has actually seized Kotabaru, while the 5th and the 18th have done a combination of seaborne landings and coming in overland from Thailand. And the overall situation, each of the 6 game turns covers roughly a fortnight. So we're into, call it about the late December 1941. The Japanese have secured Kotabaru, but they've been held up by unexpectedly heavy British defences immediately south of that near Kuala Krai. They have made much better progress on the western side of the peninsula, as you can see if I bring the camera a little bit closer. So what's happened, unfortunately, thanks to a combination of the wrong British units being in the right place at the wrong time, if that makes sense, the Japanese have broken through very heavily in the vicinity of Alor Star and Sungai Patani. Now the British are rallying, the remnants of the 11th Division, the 11th Indian Division, I should say, are trying to gather around Penang to buy enough time for an orderly withdrawal. But unfortunately for them, a minor disaster involving a bit of tank shock and a well-placed banzai attack meant that a Japanese column has pushed all the way through on the Betong Road and has managed to get all the way down through Grik, past Taiping, and all the way down to Slim River, which fell without a shot being fired. Now that was disastrous, because from the Slim River it's only a short hop down to Kuala Lumpur, which is very weakly held at the moment. There are other Commonwealth forces in the southern half of the peninsula, and as you can see, Singapore Island is very heavily garrisoned, but to have seized the Slim River so early, the Japanese have actually done very, very well. So the situation is bleak for the British, but maybe not as bleak as it could be, because another alteration we've made is we queried the victory point assignments in this game. It rewards you for killing enemy units, fair enough, and occupying certain strategic points. But the way that they're organized in this game means that the Japanese could potentially win the game just by slaughtering Commonwealth units without necessarily occupying any strategic points south of Kuala Lumpur or even approaching Singapore, and that made no sense. So we've changed the victory conditions to the fall of Singapore. If the Japanese want to win the game, they must take all 3 starred locations on the island. If they hold 1 or better, then it's a draw. If the British hold all 3 at the end of the game, then it's a Commonwealth victory. We've also introduced a surrender mechanism rule. If any Japanese unit holds a position on Singapore Island, at the end of that turn, the Commonwealth player has to roll a dice. And if they roll a 1, then the island surrenders. And the dice roll is modified. It's a -1 for each hex of Singapore Island that the Japanese occupy beyond the first. So this danger of capitulation comes in. But anyway, enough background. I will take you through a turn as modified of this game. So just to talk you through the sequence of play, we haven't altered the basic sequence in any way. So first you get the planning phase, and then you get alternating player impulses, and then lastly you get an end of turn cleanup phase. So the first thing that happens in the planning phase is you determine initiative. An initiative is determined by who's leading in victory points. There is a single victory point track here, and if the Japanese are in the ascendant, it's positive victory points. Whenever the Commonwealth earns victory points, it's subtracted from the Japanese total. So if your victory point track was showing a negative number, and you can see the counters have a plus sign on one side, and whoops, didn't flip that very well. Come on, let's try that again. And a minus on the reverse. So if it's a negative number, the Commonwealth is in the ascendancy. So turn 2 has begun with the victory point counter showing 16. So that's the Japanese. So the Japanese side of the turn marker is kept. They had the initiative on the first turn of the game. They keep it for the rest of December. So that's initiative. The next thing is the command marker phase. Now the command markers represent options and random game effects that can benefit both the Commonwealth and the Japanese player. So what happens in this phase of the game is that both sides will draw a certain number of command markers depending on how many they're permitted. This value remains unchanged throughout the game. The Commonwealth always draws 2, the Japanese always draw 4. So let's start with the Japanese, as they're the initiative leader. Just draw my counters. So the first one they draw, naval destroyers. That's quite handy. Naval gunfire support. That's put to one side. And once the Japanese use that marker for its bombardment value, it's put away. The next one is not so useful. Ties resist. If the British make any move into the Thai side of the border to try and forestall the Japanese, or to basically mess with their logistics, that represents the Thais opposing that move, and it gives the Japanese a positive combat modifier. Chances are, though, given the state of things at the moment, the British are unlikely to make any forays over the border into Thailand. They have problems of their own within the peninsula. The next one the Japanese drew is a Banzai token that gives you a powerful, albeit risky, bonus in combat. And the last one is another naval unit, heavy cruisers. Now, the Japanese did get rid of the British Naval Force Z in the previous turn, so they are doing very well for naval gunfire support because there's effectively no Commonwealth naval resistance left. So the British, of course, know nothing of what the Japanese have, so they're concentrating more on seeing what they've drawn. They get Indian Army reinforcements. That's a very welcome development. And Operation Matador. Now that is the Commonwealth equivalent of Ties Resist. Operation Matador gives the British a bonus if they launch an offensive into Thailand. Unfortunately, the window of opportunity for doing that has passed, which is quite regrettable. So as they are unlikely to need this, but they might as well keep it. It'll just take up a bit of space on their planning board. But of much greater significance is the Indian Army reinforcements. So what happens with those, and we're keeping the handy explanation at the back of the rule book, is that the British receive 3 infantry brigades potentially, and the 17th Division headquarters. That counter is then removed from play, so it can only happen once. So I need to roll a dice as the British player. So I'm going to line up the various units. There's the 17th Indian Division headquarters. I'll just put it there for convenience. And there's the 44th, 45th and 46th Infantry Brigades. So I'll just dig those out. Okay, let's see how many of these fellows we get. Well, they've just rolled a 6 for the headquarters, so unfortunately that is not received this turn. Also, they've rolled too high for the 1st Infantry Brigade, so that's not received. They have rolled low enough to get that Infantry Brigade. And they've unfortunately rolled too high for that one. So they will get a chance to try them again next turn. But unfortunately, out of the promised infantry division, only 1 brigade has arrived. But it's just in time. The way we've slightly altered the reinforcements arrival, or I should say we've altered the location at which reinforcements can arrive to reflect the historical realities a bit better. While the British still hold Kuala Lumpur, reinforcements can be placed there or in its vicinity. If they've lost Kuala Lumpur, reinforcements arrive in Singapore. So luckily for the British, just as the leading elements of the Japanese army are pulling into a town not too far away from the Malay capital, one precious brigade of Indian troops. Hope that camera can focus. Yeah, one precious brigade of Indian troops has just managed to get there. So that's a very welcome relief for the Commonwealth. I don't know how long they'll last, but they'll buy precious time. So that was the command marker phase. The next phase, excuse me, is air allocation. Now the Commonwealth is in a pretty parlous position. They at the moment only have 4 air points, 2 of which are in the damaged box and are therefore unavailable. So they'll have to have a think about what to do with those. The Japanese are in a similar situation, somewhat ahistorically. Turn 1 cost them rather heavily. So they've got 5 air counters available, but they have 3 in the damaged box. So while they do outnumber the Commonwealth still, their aircraft availability is nowhere near as good as it should be. So the Japanese and the Commonwealth would normally assign their aircraft secretly. The Japanese, I think, the way they'd want to play this, would assign 3 of their 5 air points to an air superiority mission. I'm just going to bring the camera down so you can see this chart a bit more clearly. So both players have an air organization chart. So those that are damaged stay in the damaged box, 3 counters into air superiority. And they might split up their other ones. They'll go into interdiction to try and stop enemy reinforcements coming in, and also airstrike so that the aircraft can support ground assaults. As for the Commonwealth, they are going to commit all their surviving air counters to air superiority, because essentially with such a weak force, that's their only good option. So now that missions have been assigned, we move straight into the air superiority phase. So the Japanese will roll first. Damage from this takes hold simultaneously, but you do your rolling separately. So the Japanese have their 3 air points, and they're going to roll on the air superiority table. So they've committed 3. Let's see what they roll. A 4. So cross-referencing that on the chart, that is 1 Commonwealth unit destroyed, another one placed in the damage box. So regardless of the outcome of this battle, they have effectively rendered Commonwealth air power ineffective. The Commonwealth, of course, does get a chance to shoot back. They committed 2 air points. And they roll a 3. One of the Japanese air units is placed in the damaged box. So the Japanese have actually done really, really well here. They have effectively swept the Commonwealth from the skies. That is not good for the British. So with the completion of the air superiority phase, both sides would reveal their other missions. So the Commonwealth player would know that there's an interdiction mission and an airstrike mission in the offing. Now, I did make one mistake in my overexcitement. I forgot that this incoming Indian brigade doesn't get to Kuala Lumpur automatically. Because the Japanese have committed to an interdiction mission, I suppose I could have put it by Kuala Lumpur as a statement of intent, but I have to accept the fact that it's got to run the gauntlet of Japanese air attacks. So I am going to have to roll on another table, the interdiction table, to see whether my troops are stopped from arriving, or I should say the British. Really, I'm emotionally with the British on this one, but I'll try and keep it fair. So there's the interdiction table, and the Japanese have committed 1 air point, so they're going to roll, and they have rolled a 1. Now, getting an AA result means that the interdicting air unit is placed in the damaged box, so that has not gone well for the Japanese. Not only did they fail to stop the arrival of my reinforcements into Kuala Lumpur, but just to make life even worse for them, another precious air unit has gone into the damaged box. So that is good news for the British, somewhat poorer news for the Japanese, but they still have that airstrike in their pocket, and they will have a chance to use it fairly soon, I think. So during the reinforcement phase, the British welcome an Indian brigade into Kuala Lumpur. And that concludes the reinforcements, because the Japanese get none this turn. Not that they really need it from the looks of things, but there we go. Now comes the logistics part of the planning phase. The first thing that happens is both sides receive their allocated supply point. Now, in the original game rules as written, you had a very clunky system where supply points had to be maneuvered on the board as units and micromanaged to a degree that didn't really sit well with the rest of the game, especially as they could travel in, land in any port. There were some very, very weird supply rules. So what we've done is simplified it to players just using the supply chits off map to track their available supply. And they just spend them as required. So the Commonwealth already had 3 supply saved up from the previous turn. They are entitled to receive 2 more. So that brings them up to 5. The Japanese get 3 supply every turn. Now comes some difficult decisions for the Japanese. They've got 3 supply points, which is enough to activate 3 of their headquarters for the coming turn. They also have 2 special counters which allow them to, with staff planning, it allows them to activate HQs without supply. So they're doing all right. The question is, do they want to burn supply rebuilding previously destroyed units? As we've seen, they have a lot of air units in the damaged box that could do with a bit of resurrecting. They also have 2 Imperial Guard regiments that were badly mauled in the fighting around Kotabaru, and they probably want those back. So the difficult question is, how much, if any, supply to spend on revitalizing units? And the answer is, they're going to use 2 of their precious supply points. So they're going to cash them in separately. The first one they burn is going to be used for bringing 3 of their damaged aircraft back. So aircraft are revitalized at a rate of 3 counters per supply burned. So they go into the reserve. They've been readied for frontline use, but they cannot perform any missions this turn. The second Japanese supply point will go into revitalizing the Imperial Guard's 3rd Infantry Regiment. Now those appear in the Japanese unit holding box, which is off map here. And over the course of the turn, they can be either brought in by amphibious movement. There are 2 Japanese amphibious units there. Or they can take the Japanese-controlled land route from Thailand. Both have their pros and cons. It's simpler for the Japanese to use the Thai route, but as the front line advances further south, it's also more time-consuming. The amphibious route is a bit clunkier to organise, but It is more useful because as you seize ports, you can land troops further and further south. In fact, the reinforcements could be used for an amphibious assault if the Japanese players so wished. So finally, the Japanese have a decision to make with regards their final supply point. They are going to use it to activate one of their headquarters. Now the important question is which one? It makes the most sense, given how strapped they are, to activate 25th Army's headquarters. It's the single most capable one they have. So what happens is that every other Japanese headquarters is turned to its inactive side for this turn. And it just means that they will be less effective in the coming turn. The Japanese will be able to do far less. Question is, do the Japanese want to use any of their staff planning counters? They will. They'll use one of the two they have available. Very handily, these don't get burned when used. They get put back in the Japanese cup, the pool of tokens, so they will surface again. And so the Japanese will activate. There's no real need for them to activate 18th Division's headquarters because Yamashita's already on the case. But they really do need Imperial Guard headquarters to be coordinating their effort on this side of the peninsula. So they'll wake up the Imperial Guard. So that is the Japanese sorted out. As for the Commonwealth, the Commonwealth are not going to commit any supply counters to repairs and similar, but they are going to activate every headquarters that they need to. So they will keep 11th Indian in play. They will be keeping 3rd Indian Division in play. They will keep... Oh, hang on, I've just realised I've disappeared off map there. They will keep the Australians in play by keeping their headquarters going. So that is 3 supply counters spent. So the Commonwealth cash those in. And they have 2 remaining for use next turn. So on to movement, and I'm going to zoom out a bit here just so we can see what's happening. Keep this as tightly focused as I can. So what follows now are the players' impulses, and they consist of 2 stages. In stage 1, the player with the initiative takes his impulse, followed by the non-initiative player. And then these 2 phases are repeated, but the significant difference in the second phase is that only units within range of an activated headquarters can move and fight. So effectively, during the first impulse for both players, everyone can move, everyone can fight. In the second impulse, it's much more restricted. So on their first one, the Japanese are going to make use of their amphibious capability, and they are going to commit some units to the fight. And they're going to go after fairly widely... Actually, no, they're not. That would be a bit risky. This may seem like overkill, But there is another precious airfield there at Gongkeda, which the Japanese wish to take hold of. So in their off-map holding box, they have 2 powerful Imperial Guard regiments and more than enough sea lift capability to move them. So what they're going to do is land them there. Now they're being a bit clever about this, because a direct seaward assault against a defended position, even one as outmatched as that, carries horrendous risks. Whereas if you land adjacent to your target and attack it overland, it's much, much simpler. So they're going to opt for that. The Japanese forces here are going to hold their positions, but for the most part, they are not really going to do anything, because the odds are too great in the Commonwealth's favour. There's only 1 Commonwealth brigade there, but they're entrenched in jungle terrain, and an attack could be messy. Far better, rather than risk what's left of the Imperial Guards division, far better to keep them pinned down and wait for the more successful advance on the western coast to flank them and cut them off from their supplies. I don't know how clear it is on the map, but there's only a single railway line connecting that position to the main supply hubs, and it is perilously close to being cut, unless the Commonwealth can try and hold those 2 critical towns, Kulao and Raub. If they lose both of those, it's going to be bad for any units north of that position. So the Japanese will hold there. They are going to send the remaining units. So we have the Imperial Guard and the 18th Division's reconnaissance elements, and 2 of the 18th Division's infantry regiments. So they're going to come from the north, and they're going to come down the Thai route. So although the Japanese treat railways as roads, they get to sort of have a ride on them for half the movement costs, so they can go pretty fast. So the Imperial Guard recon unit can pretty much reach its parent formation and join in if there's enough room for it. Yes, they can enter Qualacry and team up with the engineer units there, just to add a little bit more muscle. The 18th Division's recon unit is going to go in the other direction to join its parent formation. Now they're going to stay back here in reserve because the formations ahead of them are already fairly full. And of course the last 2 infantry divisions of the 18th, they might as well catch up. They're going to take a different route though. They're going to head across the road through the highlands to try and catch up with the rest over there, because the units here are more than capable of biting off Penang. What they want to do is add punch to their main thrusts down the peninsula. Now, speaking of which, it's very tempting for the Japanese to make a move on their new objectives. So that armoured unit there is going to press in and occupy Raub. The infantry further back are going to seize Kulao. But they're not going to press on to Kuala Lumpur just yet. Now that reinforcements have arrived, it might be a bit tricky for them to do so. So there's going to be a bit of a reorganisation. Ooh, actually, come to think of it. No, it would be smarter for the Japanese armour to press on and occupy the central town of Jarantut, and the infantry further back can go. The infantry can hold Raub. In fact, one infantry division will move into Raub, the other one will move into Kulao. So there we go, in one swift stroke, all the Commonwealth's routes north have been severed, and it means that all these poor fellows up here are now out of supply, which can have pretty devastating consequences. In the meantime, all these other fellows will push on south. Although actually I'm tempted, if I were the Japanese, I'd be tempted to leave them as garrisons just to make sure these towns are held, because there will be the remnants of Commonwealth units trickling south in an effort to save themselves. There's not much point leaving these towns open for them. And of course the headquarters units. Makes sense for Yamashita's headquarters to go forward. And the position on the Slim River is a good one for them to be able to support all of their units in the vicinity in the event of an attack. Now the Japanese here are already pretty much where they want to be, so there'll be no further movement from them over there. So that's that. The Japanese have made their moves. Just make sure there's nobody underneath these that I would want to send anywhere. There isn't really. Most of what's back here is airfield battalions, trying to bring newly captured airfields into service. So yes, that is all the movement the Japanese will make initially. It is very tempting for them to push on to Kuala Lumpur, but it would be risking combat at odds that are not entirely favourable, and they're doing well enough at this stage in the campaign for them to not hurry quite so much. So there we go. The only thing that remains is to think about where they want to place that. So it's now the bombardment phase. And the Japanese have to think about who they want to soften up and where. Now it is tempting, given that there are reinforcements on the way, for the Japanese to make an assault there after all. So they'll throw in an aerial bombardment. They don't have to commit to a ground assault. They can see what the bombardment achieves before deciding. And they also have their 2 naval counters, which they are tempted to make use of this turn. So their destroyers. Now the Japanese naval units can only operate on the eastern side of the peninsula. So they have a choice. They can soften up the already very weak defenders at Gongkeda. They can just about reach the 28th Indian as well, so it's tempting, just because that coastal strip is close enough. It is tempting to have the destroyers support the bombing attack on the 28th Indian Brigade, while the cruisers go and cause some mischief further south. In fact, they might well do that. They're going to bombard the British positions at Kuantan. So that is the bombardments assigned, and it's now the land combat phase. We'll resolve the bombardments first. So we've got 3 strength points of cruisers. Let's just do some zooming in again so you can see what's going on. And handily enough, that bombardment there is adjacent to the bombardment table. So we have 3 strength points. Oof, and the Japanese roll a 6. That was painful. So what happens there is if on a result of a D, you flip all activated headquarters to their inactivated side. Now, luckily, the Commonwealth had no headquarters units in the target hex. Furthermore, you eliminate a supply point and place a suppression marker on the unit. That is rather unfortunate for the Commonwealth. So one of their precious supply points is assumed to have been destroyed in the attack. That's not good news. And the units in the town are suppressed. Now that's not so bad in this instance because they weren't really planning on doing anything this turn, and they weren't about to come under attack, but the loss of supply points is serious. Over here, we have the joint air-naval bombardment of that brigade. So we have the aircraft plus 2 points of bombardment for the destroyers. That gives us column 3 on the bombardment table. Now the defending units are in jungle, which is a 2-column shift to the left. So even if they roll well, they're going to be hard put to try and affect them in that position. And they roll a 3. So for all that effort expended, the Commonwealth unit is largely unhurt. So that is the bombardment phase. Now comes the Japanese ground attack phase. Now, in light of how ineffective that bombardment was, the Japanese are going to hold their positions there. There'll be no attack. However, the 2 regiments who landed at Gongkeda are most definitely going to attack. So it's the total of their attack values, the first number, so a total of 12, against the Commonwealth defense of 1. So we're looking at 12 to 1, and the Japanese are going to assault. So on the odds table, that's looking ridiculously in their favour. The defenders are occupying a town rather than a city. So that's a miserable column shift to the left. That's still using the 6 to 1 odds table. It's not looking good. Incidentally, no matter how many troops you pile on, you can never achieve better than 7 to 1 odds. So the Japanese roll a 3, and they've got a DS, which means defender shattered. Now what happens with a defender shattered result is that units equal to 50% of the attacking combat factors are destroyed, and any survivors retreat. Now this is such a tiny unit that it was never going to come back from that, so it's placed straight in the Commonwealth eliminated box. It can be rebuilt through the expenditure of supply on a future turn, but what happens is that the Japanese march in after a very desultory resistance, take the town of Gongkeda, and it is theirs. So that airfield has fallen to them. Now they can't make use of it this turn. At the beginning of next turn, they can increase their air points by 1 because they've seized another airfield, but only if they occupy it with an airfield unit. So what I mean by airfield unit is you have the airbase, ground and logistical support unit. So the Japanese will have to find a spare one of those to be able to bring the Gongkeda airfield online. So much for events on the east coast. What about the west coast, which I think is going to see some heavy action now? The Japanese are going to jump at the chance to destroy an Allied headquarters unit. So the first attack they're going to commit is these 3 infantry regiments on the coast just advancing straight into the eastern half of Penang. So it's 18 on 2. So 9-1 odds. That's absolutely horrible. The headquarters is defending in a town, which reduces